And joining us is a gentleman who is no stranger to the Observer. Let me say a special good evening to Princestown MP and UNC Shadow Minister of Public Utilities, Mr. Barry Padarath. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mikey, to you and your viewers.
Thank you so much for taking time out. I know you have quite a schedule. The Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission, T&TEC, owes the national gas company NGC over $4 billion. And consumers will have to assist in repaying this as the government cannot at this time. Well, I want to say this, on record. We, and I think I talk for many of the citizens here, Mr. Padarath, we can't pay this at this time either. I mean, how unfair is this?
Well, Mikey, we have to ask the question, how did we arrive at this position that NGC is owed $4 billion by T&TEC? Let's backtrack for a minute. 1 year ago, a question was filed in the Parliament asking the Minister of Public Utilities to indicate to Trinidad and Tobago what was the debt between government and T&TEC in terms of how much did the state owe T&TEC as of September 23. We are now in September 24. And the answer that was provided in writing to the Parliament was that the state owes T&TEC $1.5 billion. Let me repeat that. The state owes T&TEC $1.5 billion as of 2023. Now, things did not get better in 2023 to 2024. Things got worse. So that figure is now almost $1.8 billion, which is almost half of the debt between NGC and T&TEC. And because the state has allowed this bill to climb to an astronomical figure of close to $1.8 billion, it has put T&TEC in the red. And therefore, T&TEC has not been able to meet its expenses. Now, how does T&TEC owe $4 billion to NGC? What happens is that T&TEC purchases gas from NGC at a subsidized cost. And this subsidized cost is determined by the Cabinet. So the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago sets the price that NGC will sell natural gas to T&TEC for the production of electricity. And that is how we have arrived at this $4 billion debt. Because for the past 9 years, the government has not serviced the debt. And how has the government not serviced the debt? It is because they have failed to pay T&TEC $1.8 billion. They have failed to run the company as a profitable company in terms of a proper structured management plan, in terms of change management to make the company more profitable, to make the company more self-sufficient and self-reliable. And therefore, almost 10 years later, where T&TEC is in the red in terms of how much the state owes, almost $1.8 billion, which is almost half of the $4 billion that is owed to NGC, T&TEC is simply unable to meet its expenses. And therefore, I will repeat how I started, which is, how did we arrive at that? We arrived at that because the government put T&TEC in the position that it is in today. And now, on the other side of his mouth, the Minister of Public Utilities is saying that the citizens must contribute and the citizens must pay that $4 billion debt. But it was the government who has put T&TEC in that, because government is the largest debtor to T&TEC. $1.8 billion across state enterprises, ministries, offices that falls under the purview of the government. They have allowed these bills to climb and grow astronomically. And the failure to deal with proper management in terms of investment, in terms of turning around the company at T&TEC, has forced them in the position that they are in today. So essentially what the minister is signaling that government in the next budget or ahead of the rate review, because you would recall when they first proposed this rate review, they went around the country doing these public consultations. And it was the opposition, UNC, through Mrs. Kamala Prasad-Bisesa and myself as Shadow Minister of Public Utilities, that went to every single one of these consultations and dealt with the issues as it relates to how they arrive at these new rates. We were able to also get our civil society on board in terms of engaging the corporations, engaging communities where they were holding these public consultations to air to air their views. And the pushback was so tremendous that up to today, the RIC has sent to the cabinet since early of the first quarter of this year. We are almost at the end of this year, and the government has not indicated to the population what that rate increase will be. And it is all because we are in a general election year. The government understands, and their handlers understand, that should they announce what the new rate increase is going to be now, on the cusp of that general election, it will put them further in a disadvantageous position, because people are just waiting to vote them out, because people just simply do not have the revenue, they do not have the income to meet these additional expenses, particularly when it is of no fault of theirs. Why is the government asking the citizenry to pay a debt of $4 billion when half of that debt is owed by the state? And therefore, if half of the debt is owed by the state, the first question should be asked is, what immediate steps has the government taken to remedy that situation, to put T&TEC and NGC in a better position?
And I agree with you. I agree with you, Mr. Padarath, 100%. And then to have the audacity to say, listen, consumers in this country continue to pay the lowest for water and electricity. And he said it should really dawn heavy on our minds that on a yearly basis, we spend over, which means government, over 2.1 billion in the water sector to keep WASA going. So whilst yes, we are paying the lowest rates for water, the government has to find the revenues to ensure that we get water as best as we can, and in the same way for electricity. Again, I mean, basically saying, listen, this bill has to be paid. You have to understand, as citizens, you are paying the lowest rate. So there should be no, no sort of misunderstanding about that.
Let's deal with that argument of
right.
that the government is putting forward that citizens are paying the lowest rates in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. When you measure the level of productivity and you measure the level of service and delivery in other parts of the world that have higher water and electricity prices than us, it is chalk and cheese. And therefore, all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago are asking for is that if I am expected to pay a rate at A, then I expect a proper service, a proper supply, and a proper delivery. And therefore, the expectations must meet the demands that are being placed on the citizens. And that was one of the things that the opposition raised with the RIC, because when you look at the Regulated Industries Commission remit, part of their remit in determining new rates has to be that they look at the quality of service, the quality of delivery, the quality of the product that is passed on from WASA and T&TEC. And only if it is at a satisfactory level, then you come into play this rate review and you look at, okay, well, maybe we can do an increase. But this is a country that moved from 77% of pipe-borne water to 24/7 supply under Kamla Prasad Biswas administration. So WASA admitting at a Joint Select Committee of Parliament only 1 year ago under People's National Movement, Keith Rowley-led administration, that they moved this country from 77% 24/7 under Kamla to today 16% under Keith Rowley. And therefore the argument must be made. And I think that is why citizens are very right in their approach in terms of resisting this water and electricity increase, because they understand that when they turn on their taps, they do not get water. When they flip a switch, many times there's a low voltage, there are outages. People in this country have experienced low voltage and outages that have affected their appliances. They have lost fridge, TV, electric stoves, microwave, etc. And they have received no compensation.
No compensation whatsoever, no.
And therefore, in the climate that we have existing right now, in terms of a very bad economy, in terms of high unemployment, where people I often say that people are living to survive. They're living essentially to survive in this country. They're not living. They're surviving in this country day to day. you ask yourself, where is the residual income going to come from when people's incomes have not increased? And therefore, if you are making demands on them to pay this $4 billion bill that T&TEC owes to NGC, the first person that should be at the top of that line paying the $1.8 billion that it owes to T&TEC so that T&TEC can then make that payment to NGC is the state.
Yeah, and
Marvin Gonzalez is not saying a word about that.
And that's the
Marvin
point.
Gonzalez is parroting the policy of the government because he can drive a luxury vehicle. He can sleep in air-conditioned comfort. He could eat macaroni pie 2-3 times through the week. He could take his children and his family to the cinema. These are things that they have told the population they need to cut back on. But you must lead by example, and therefore the question must be placed at the minister and the government. What immediate steps have you taken to pay that debt that you have racked up?
Yeah, and
telling the population that they need to pay $4 billion.
And that's a very strong point. If we just revisit what you spoke about, $1.8 billion. I mean, again, citizens are asking, but listen, many of these things were budgeted. I mean, you must have had some plan, as you mentioned earlier, to generate revenue in order to pay this, because this problem did not start overnight. It didn't occur overnight. It's a recurring factor for the last 9, almost 10 years. So where's this money that's always budgeted? Because last night, of course, at the UNC meeting, the opposition leader laid out, she said, listen, the money is gone, and it went to stuff like paintings, which is $3 million, a Benz for $2 million, a phone call to former President Trump was $16 million, Taruba Stadium $210 million, and she went on and said, listen, when you add up all of these things, we could have paid this bill 3 times over. Where's this money that is supposed to be budgeted that seems to just evaporate? I mean, you're hearing it with the Ministry of Education, there's not enough money to fix the schools, but that was laid out in the budget. So where's this money going?
Mikey, what we have noticed over the past few budgets in particular is that there have been a lot of shifting and moving around of money. So when you have the Standing Finance Committee of the Parliament after the budget is read, and you see us sitting down there from 10 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock in the night, asking repetitive questions, it gives us the opportunity to go through line item by line item, interrogating, well, why this sum has been identified and why not a particular sum. What we have noticed is a lot of under-budgeting has happened. And therefore, there are key critical areas, particularly in public utilities, because public utilities is something that affects your day-to-day life. When you turn on a tap and you cannot get water, when you put on a switch and you cannot get electricity, it impacts on your day-to-day living. And therefore, many times when you go through ministries, you go through state enterprises, and you look under the item of public utilities, you would see, well, okay, they've allocated $200,000 for this year, but then you're seeing, well, last year it was $100,000, and you ask, well, why are you allocating $200,000 this year, but last year it was $100,000? What would have accounted for an additional $100,000 this year? And the minister will tell you this has to do with arrears, and you ask, well, why are you paying arrears? And when I started off by telling you they've been shifting money around, they will now come with the $200,000 this year, having added the $100,000 they didn't pay last year, but go into the following year with $200,000 still not paying that, and therefore client taking it to another year, increasing it now by another $100,000, taking it to $300,000, because what they have done is that they have now taken that $200,000 that was identified to pay this year and last year's arrears, and they have now prioritized it in different areas. And some of those areas are some of the things that you have mentioned. The $16 million to Trump, the $225 million acquisition of Massey Communications, a lot of vanity projects, a lot of vanity spending that does not impact on the day-to-day living. So there's the argument that the Minister of Public Utilities is putting forward that everyone needs to pay a bit and contribute. But when you're seeing waste, mismanagement, and corruption happening across the board in government, ministries, state agencies, state enterprises, and you see this type of spending on things that do not impact on the day-to-day living, that does not improve the standard and conditions of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, it can only be surmised that the priorities of this government is totally messed up. The priorities of this government is on vanity things like paintings, like vehicles, to overseas travel, etc. And you have the start of the school term where the ministers cannot tell you how many schools ahead of the opening of the term, how many schools are prepared to be open in terms of completion of repairs, etc. Just the other day, $500 million you pulled out of WASA in the budget in the area of materials, supplies, repairs. The Caroni water treatment plant was shut down for 4 days. You know why? Because they had to put in a new electrical system. They had to make upgrades to the booster stations there, the critical infrastructure. We told them, you don't shut down major infrastructure that will impact on citizens in terms of water, electricity, etc. What you do is that there's continuous maintenance. But because they have prioritized in the wrong areas, into the vanity areas, and not looked at the critical areas that impact on the quality of people's lives and their day-to-day living, what you are now seeing happening is that those critical areas is being impacted negatively because there's no spending, there's no priority, there's no maintenance, there's no repairs in these areas. And similarly, what you're seeing by the announcement by the Minister of Public Utilities is exactly that. Why have you allowed a bill of $4 billion to balloon in your 10th year of being in office? This has started between the period 2016 to 2024, when the UNC, opposition UNC, was the People's Partnership in Government. How were we able to contain and ensure that the bills between NGC and T&TEC did not balloon? We were able to manage that so that you did not put T&TEC in the red, you did not mismanage the company. But we are always of the belief that the government is its intention is to drive state companies and state enterprises like TSCT, like Petritrin, like WASA, and now like T&TEC into the ground so that they can privatize these companies for the interest and the benefit of the friends, families, and financiers of the People's National Movement. And that is where they're taking us with respect to the public utilities companies, driving those companies into the ground so that the companies cannot self-sustain themselves. And essentially what you have is that they will then sell out to foreign investors and local investors here, who will then increase the price 2 and 3 times, and citizens will have no choice because there's no competitive markets in terms of electricity, public utilities in terms of WASA, even postal, TSCT, etc. So they're really setting the stage. You know, many people often say, they say, I don't think it can get much worse than this. Start to say Trinidad and Tobago, should you take God out of your thoughts and put them in for a third term? That is what you can expect. You can expect the privatization of a lot of these public utilities companies. You're just seeing it one instance again with T&TEC. It's like every time government is insistent or their backs are against the wall with respect to bills that they cannot pay and financial obligations that they cannot meet, they impose taxes on the population or they impose further increases. Government has not articulated up to this time how much foreign direct investment they have been able to bring into the country. How much additional revenue have you been able to look at with respect to increasing production in the hydrocarbon sector, in the non-manufacturing sector, in the agricultural sector? These are things that generate revenues. And therefore, when the UNC, like you mentioned, Mrs. Musabi Sessa talks about turnaround in healthcare when the UNC takes office again and the things that will happen, it is because we have identified where the revenue streams will come from, how we will be able to generate these revenue streams. You cannot tell a beleaguered population where unemployment is high, food prices are high, where people are struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis, where their salaries have not increased, where pension has not increased over the last 2 to 3 years, where people are fighting for grants, where ministers are telling them when you line up a hamper that you are greedy. You cannot tell that population, I'm adding an additional burden to you now with property tax, higher water and electricity rates, and now telling them you are the reason why the $4 billion, why T&TEC owes $4 billion to NGC. That is hogwash.
It has to be. It has to be. I mean, you're telling taxpayers that you will have to pay more because T&TEC, if you call upon them to pay that gas price of $4 billion, then someone has to pay for it, and it will fall to you, the consumers. You know, Mr. Parra, what hurts me the most in all of this, I think about the elderly, the senior citizens. I mean, when you give your all to a country and you put your shoulder to the wheel and you sacrifice and send your children and you see your grandchildren, and at the end of the day you have become, I mean, just totally sidelined. How are they keeping their head above water? They're on a fixed income. They don't have, they can't afford luxuries of all of that, but they have to go down there and pay these bills, and more has to be taken out, and they're not getting an increase in pension. My God, somebody needs to have a heart.
Correct. But you know, Mikey, you mentioned it a little while ago, and it has to do with um, the government has seemed to be totally detached from the rest of the society.
Yeah.
They live in their ivory towers and tell us about riding bicycles to work, cooking in coal pots, eating macaroni pie 2 times for the month, going to the cinema once for the month. It tells you about the disconnect because they do not live the reality of going to the supermarket and not being able to buy baby milk, baby formula, diapers for their children because they receive a salary of $40,000 and $50,000 per month. And that is not the reality of the average citizen. I often ask myself, you know, I'm an MP, and I ask myself, how do people who work in stores, who have a rent to pay, their children to go to school, survive on a salary, a basic salary of $3,000 for the month, when half of that is your rent alone? The other half is buying the basics to go to the supermarket. And then on top of that, you have to pay utilities, you have to pay for transport, etc.
Yeah,
So that is why I tell you it has really boiled down to citizens as trying to survive. They're not living, they're surviving day to day in this country. You used a word earlier that really, I think, encapsulates this entire situation. You used the word audacity. You know, President Obama had a book called The Audacity of Hope. And Trinidad and Tobago is now in a position where they feel hopeless, they feel helpless, they feel hapless. And it is incumbent on the UNC. And that is why when we speak about our plans and our policies in terms of how we will create the 50,000 jobs, how we will make the changes in healthcare. Why? Because we have already said that we will put an immediate stop to any increase in water and electricity rates coming into government. We will review it and then decide in terms of how we will service the debt and so on. But until you can put your citizenry in a position where they can afford basic food, shelter, medicine, healthcare, providing for their children, then you cannot continue to impose these additional hardships on them without looking for alternative measures and alternative revenue streams to keep your country afloat. You know, I think it was one famous US president that said, you cannot tax a society into prosperity. You cannot continue to impose all of this and think that things are going to turn around. It is these same people who have to go to the supermarkets, who have to pay the bills, that keeps an economy running. And that is why, off the top of our head, we can tell you. You know, I saw one editorial asking, well, Kamala must say, well, where's she going to get the money to do all of this? We have told you how we did it before. We incentivized the oil and gas sector so much so that you had companies coming in, drilling deep sea water, shallow. It's like never before. Today, you hardly have companies, foreign companies, tapping into drilling both at a deep sea and at a shallow water level. You're not seeing the non-manufacturing sector picking up. When you had Mitsubishi coming in, the Japanese company coming in from Japan into Trinidad for that Mitsubishi project, which is one of the most successful projects today, it tells you how we intend on raising those revenues, because we did it once and we will do it again. You have to look at external factors. You cannot depend on the population to pay the debts of the government. And that is the point I'm making. Every step of the way, the government is now telling the situation, telling the citizens, the problems that we are facing, you are the reason. You are the fault for those problems. So they have now moved away from blaming Kamala and blaming the UNC to now blaming the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And that is what Marvin Gonzalez did. He blamed them, Trinidad and Tobago citizens, for the position that T&TEC is in today in terms of the debt that T&TEC owes to NGC.
And then making it seem as though they're doing us a favor.
Therefore, I noticed that there's a deafening silence coming from the media. Nobody in the media has been asking the minister, well, minister, has the government paid the $1.8 billion in debt that T&TEC, that they owe to T&TEC, because to me that will be the first major step in clearing out the $4 billion. It's easy. There's no rocket science like that. If the government pays its bills to T&TEC, T&TEC will be able to pay
That's
it.
right. You're right.
It's simple as
It's
that.
simple as that. You're right.
But Mikey, before I go, there's one other issue that I want to raise.
Sure.
It has to do with the issue of the subsidy.
Yeah.
For 2 years, I've been asking about the subsidy because I don't think Trinbagonians understand how it works. The cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago determines the price that NBC sells natural gas to T&TEC for the production of electricity. So T&TEC buys the natural gas as a subsidized cost, but the government determines the price. I've been asking for 2 years whether the government is going to remove the subsidy, and the government has been silent on this issue. I've been up and down this country for the Regulated Industries Commission, the public consultations, asking this question as well. Because the citizens of this country must go into a general election with their eyes wide open. They must know that post-general election, whether or not a P&M government, if it gets a third term, whether or not they will impose the higher electricity rates by also removing completely the subsidy. And that is something that they are not answering. So when factoring into the rate increase, the RIC will also factor in whether or not the government continues to subsidize partially or fully the cost of natural gas that T&TEC buys natural gas from NTC. And that is an issue that we must know ahead of the general election. And therefore, why is the government holding on to the Regulated Industries Commission report? The Regulated Industries Commission sent their report to the Cabinet in March of this year. Up to this time, government has not said what is their position. We advise that the government handlers, their PR people are telling them, hold your hand.
Yeah.
Don't go and announce any rate
This is
rate
not the
increases
time. Yeah, this is not the time.
Go into the election, and if you win the election, then, but don't do it before. I am saying that if that is the plan of the PNM to increase, which we know it is the plan of the PNM, then citizens must go into this election with their eyes wide open,
I agree.
knowing that they have not discarded a rate increase for water and electricity. They are simply just holding it until elections are over. They have either won or lost, because in our case, we have already indicated that we will not implement until there's a review and until the economy is growing and people are in jobs and people can maintain a proper standard of living, etc. It has to be that also the supply that you put out there in terms of supply for water and electricity, there has to be a satisfactory supply. It cannot be that people turn on taps, so they get no water. When they do get water, it's for an hour or two, drip by drip by drip, or it's coming through your pipes like Morby.
That's not going to work. That's not going to cut it.
No, it's not going to work.
We
and
want
therefore,
efficiency.
that's the last point I wanted to raise in terms of the subsidy. And I'm calling once more for them to say what is the government's position on the subsidy. Is the Minister of Finance going to make a determination in terms of an announcement, or whether the Minister of Public Utilities during the budget? But citizens need to know. They need to know what they are voting for. And if people take God out of their thoughts and go to the polls and vote for the PNM, then they are voting once more for higher water and electricity rates.
Yeah.
They're voting for the property to continue paying the property tax. They're voting for all these vanity projects, and you cannot get proper repairs and maintenance done for schools. And essentially, you're voting for the continuation of hardship. And therefore, when the UNC tell you what our plans and policies, and you ask us, well, how are you going to finance it? I've just articulated to you in 2-3 minutes how we are going to finance it, how we are going to grow the economy. It happened once before, and it will happen again should they give us the opportunity. So those were some of the issues I was happy
Thank
to
you so much.
with me this evening and explain the situation. I will continue over the next few days to explain in the public space more about the payment that is needed from the government to make T&TEC self-sufficient and self-reliable. And until the government has indicated that they have paid that $1.8 billion, then I think on election day, the population needs to tell Marvin Gonzalez and the PNM where to get off.
I agree with you. Thank you so much, Mr. Padarath. Keep up the good work, and best of luck to you and the entire team. We'll be checking in with you, of course, periodically. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mikey.
Yeah.